joined us by clicking on the icon on the connected timetable rather than by using the URL link, and you can't really hear us very well, then can I invite you to look on the chat and find the link on there, which will give you a better connection. And the chat, if you don't know where it is at the bottom of your page under the pictures in the middle. If you have a question, can I ask you to post it in chat and also to raise your blue hand, which you will find if you click on participants, and that will come up as a bar on the right hand side of the picture, and then find your own name and indicate that you want to speak. I'm going to ask John McDonnell to speak first, and then Apsana Begum. They both have other events to go to, so I'm going to take questions for them first, and then after that we will have Ruth Cadbury and Daniel Zeichner, and if Johnny Reynolds has managed to join us, then I will ask him to speak too.
Jonathan Reynolds is just coming in now.
Just coming in, okay.
Yeah.
So in which case I will just check with Jonathan when he's available and if he's available until what time, and then take him at a time when he can manage. I don't need to say an awful lot about our speakers, but because most of them are known to most of us, other than thank you so much for giving us your time and commitment. I know Jonathan Reynolds is incredibly busy as Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, but he's also been a committed advocate of electoral reform for many years, as has Ruth Cadbury, who's been speaking for us to the media. John McDonnell has spoken passionately on electoral reform at past conferences where I've heard him when he was a bit busier than he is now. And and Apsana Begum is our wonderful new MP for Poplar and Limehouse, and Daniel Zeichner is our Labour front bench champion for rural areas in the Shadow DEFRA team, in my humble opinion, the best Shadow team, because I was there myself one time. And of course, in rural areas, most Labour votes have no effect on the general election results. So it's great to have Daniel with us too. So without further ado, I will ask John to speak to us.
Okay. Just to say, Johnny Reynolds, do you need to go off? As a humble backbencher, I want to give way to a shadow cabinet member. Are you in a rush? Seriously, Johnny, do you need to rush off?
You need to unmute yourself, John. Yes, it.
Sorry, someone's controlling the mute. John, no, I'm always happy to listen to you, mate. So happy to go.
All right, thanks, Johnny. But the reason I've got to go off is there's a whole series of online fringes, and it's just, this is a great turnout online for this discussion. I do wish we were back in my home city of Liverpool meeting properly, but no, we'll get there eventually. Look, just very briefly from me, obviously devastating loss at the election, but we're picking ourselves up, and we're obviously with a new leadership. Here's the opportunity to have a stand back and take stock of where we got to and also where we need to go and the policy programme that we need. Keir's quite rightfully low to get involved in too much of a detail of policy at the moment because there's an election years off, but now's the time to start laying at least the start of the internal discussions about where we go from here. What sort of programme do we want? And this time round, I think it's sad it's going to be an election in a few years' time, not immediate, but this time round it does give us the opportunity of actually laying the foundations for the debate that we need to have about electoral reform and fair voting. And so we've got to seize the opportunity. That's my view. That's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is I put this in the context of the last general election. Boris Johnson with an 80-seat majority actually I don't think does reflect the reality of the political support that there was across the parties, clearly doesn't. And if we had a fair electoral system, we would not have what is effectively we're seeing, I think, quite a dangerous electoral dictatorship that we have at the moment. And I say that in all seriousness. I've accused Johnson and Trump of being proto-fascist, and of course the Daily Telegraph went ballistic at that. But actually the way in which our electoral system works enables this sort of extreme right-wing government to come into power and virtually be unaccountable for its actions. And the reason I use that language, because my fear is that the electoral system has delivered up someone who actually has no respect for the democratic values and virtues, has no respect for the democratic institutions. He's ignored Parliament, he's closed Parliament down. You saw last year, he's tried to intimidate the courts, and at the same time, the reality is we have a Prime Minister who has, let's put no further than this, has quite a significant difficulty in determining what's truth and what's untruth. Others would call him a born liar, but I wouldn't go that far. Anyway, I think the people will recognise, I think, that the electoral system, if it operated in a fair way, we would not have thrown up a government like this, and it would not operate in the way it did. It would be much more accountable, and there would have to be much more consensus building within Parliament and within the country for the management of, well, issues and crises like the pandemic that we're dealing with at the moment. So I think there's a golden opportunity now to almost point to the electoral system and its consequences of what it's thrown up in this government and learn some lessons from it. So that gives us the opportunity to open the discussion up within our party and beyond that. How do we do that? And I think this is the issue now. We've really got to have a clear think about. In the last general election manifestos, in the 2017 manifesto, there was a commitment to the convening of a constitutional convention. That never happened. I still don't fully understand why it never happened, but that never happened. I think that's one mechanism we can call for again, some form of constitutional convention that we're inevitably going to have to look at the relationship between central government and local government again, potentially regional government, and yes, the relationships between Scotland and Wales and England. So we need to, I think, encourage the party to set up that constitutional convention, but it must include a proper discussion and eventually a determination of our policy on fair voting. And in that way, I think we can have a sensible debate about how we go forward. Linked to that, and I'd like people's views on this, I do actually support the concept of citizens' assemblies, looking at issues, having a real debate and coming forward with fresh ideas. And I wonder whether or not we shouldn't be working with others to have a citizens' assembly much wider than some of the exercises that have gone on so far. And I know the work that Graham Allen and others have done around these sorts of issues is quite important, but maybe we should have one that simply focuses on the electoral system itself rather than the broader range of issues, and then come back with proposals for the party. Because in some ways, you know, we seem to win the argument, but we don't win the support. So somehow what we've got to do is find a mechanism by which we can develop the discussions and arguments, make people feel more comfortable, and as a result of that, not feel challenged by the change in the electoral system that we propose, and that also that they feel, yes, they're part of a consensus building exercise. In that way, I think we can win the argument and win the policy proposals within the party. And I think as a result of that, when we go into government, we'll be ready to hit the deck running with the implementation of a reform programme. In the meantime, I just say this as alongside other parliamentarians, I think also that to encourage that debate, we need to sit down and look again. Others have done this in the past. I think it has helped the debate. But look again at every parliamentary mechanism that we can seize upon to encourage the debate and encourage the floor of the House of Commons to start looking at these issues. I know often they're loath to, MPs are loath to between parliaments like this, but I think it's quite, now at the early stage of a parliament, we've got that opportunity. So it is looking at the different mechanisms and also testing the water whenever we can with potential either, not just early day motions, but maybe some private member legislation or any amendments to legislation that might be going through to encourage the debate. Can I also go back to my favourite hobby horse, which sometimes in these meetings I get panned on. I do want to link this as well to the abolition of the House of Lords. I'm still desperately committed to getting rid of this archaic system where people are appointed or are born into government in this country. And as a result of that, I think, although we have a revising chamber, we also have one at times that can be a distortion of our democratic system as well. So I do think as well we should link it, some of our campaigning, to the abolition of the Amnesty Laws issue, and yes, argue that in addition to our call for the Commons to be elected on a proportional basis with fair voting, that if we are to have a revising chamber, it should also be, and it could, from my view, it could be one of the ways in which we link it to other constitutional changes, particularly with regard to adequate representation of the regions within Parliament, and also obviously Scotland and Wales. And in that way, I think it enables people to have a wider voice and a wider say about the future of our country. So they're my proposals at the moment. As I say, we've got a bit of a breathing space now, but literally between elections, it's usually the first 18 months, no more than 2 years, in which a party's views are formed around the basic policy structure for its future manifesto. After the second year, literally, you're virtually into a general election campaign. So although we've got a bit of a breathing space, I do think there is a sense of urgency around this issue where we need to start making sure we start the debate, engage in a dialogue with the new leadership, a constructive dialogue with the new leadership about how we can debate and discuss this policy within the party, and how we can look at, as I say, maybe some innovative ways of engaging on a wider basis, like a citizens' assembly, a constitutional convention. And in that way, I think a constructive debate can be engaged upon and can come forward. I think if, once we get a rational discussion of this, I find we can come forward with arguments I think most of us would support, and therefore a policy that we would support. I don't want to go through another election like the last one, where, to be frank, we've thrown up a government that I fervently believe does not reflect the general will of the population overall, and which is now, we're seeing now, is unrestrained in its incompetence, but also in the way it exercises that power. And I don't think we've ever seen a government like this in terms of its mendacity, of course, because of the Prime Minister's own incapability of abiding by anything that resembles the truth, but also, as I say, its contempt for the democratic institutions and values we'd normally expect to be the bulwarks of our democracy. And that ranges not just the contempt for Parliament and the courts, but also the way in which, for example, senior civil servants are squeezed out, thrown out if they slightly disagree or give advice the Prime Minister doesn't like. And also, I have to say as well, the way contracts are awarded in government now, which verge on corruption. So I think there's a climate now that we can draw upon for change as a result of the behaviour of this government, which exposes the failures of our electoral system. Thanks, Sandy, for that.
Thanks, John. That's great. Johnny, are you okay to wait for another quarter of an hour? Or would you like to speak now? You're okay, fine. In which case, I will then call on Apsana Begum to speak to us next. Can I please urge everybody, if you've got a question, put the question in the chat, but also raise your hand on the participants thing, because that way it makes it much easier for us to unmute you when we come to ask you your question. Okay, Apsana, please, will you speak to us now?
Thank you so much, Sandy, and greetings to everybody on this call. It's good to see so many people, over 100 people on this call. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail, I think, in terms of 2019 and 2017. And I want to sort of, I guess I don't want to recall, but, there is that painful memory of, the gloating media descriptions summing up Labour's performance, the lowest since 1935, and, that we'd lost more than 50% of the seats we won in 2001. And, the Channel 4 fact checker pointed out, the comparison with 1935 is pretty odd, because that pre-war election was actually something of a victory for the still kind of young Labour Party at the time, and saw Clement Attlee gain over 100 seats compared to the previous ballot. So, I think in truth, Labour's share of the vote isn't quite so bad in historical terms. And having won 32% of the votes cast under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, Labour did better than any of his predecessors Gordon Brown in 2019, 29%, was Ed Miliband in 2015, 30%, and Labour secured significantly more votes in this 2019 election than in 2015, 2010, and even in 2005. But it's also true that Labour received only 455,000 fewer votes in 2019 than 18 years earlier. And it's certainly the case that we lost terribly. And it was an awful result from our perspective. And nothing I'm saying is trying to make light of that at all. 2019 saw a significant decline in Labour seat share, a net loss of obviously 59 MPs compared to 2017. But I do think it's very important to point out how under the first past the post system, the number of seats won or lost alone can be a deceptive measure of this scale of success or failure. And similarly, the Lib Dems suffered their reduction in seats despite a 4% increase in vote share. And of course, we know, barely a percentage increase delivered both the Tories and the SNP a landslide. And I just want to talk a little bit about Brexit as well. So, in terms of analysing the 2019 general election, we must sort of seek to understand how a single issue cut across traditional party loyalties, and the collapse of the Brexit Party into the Conservative Party had obviously particular significance if you look at voter percentages. There's no way sort of getting away from it. 52 of the 59 seats lost during the 2019 general election voted to leave the EU in 2016, and we lost 8 Remain constituencies. We know in Stroud and Kensington, Labour lost their vote being split by a third party, and the others were in Scotland. And the results in Labour heartlands in the North and Midlands obviously have a torturous echo of Labour's disastrous loss of Scotland in 2015. So it's not something that can be easily dismissed, losing seats to the Tories in some cases for the first time in decades. But going back even before that to the 2017 general election, the Labour Party enjoyed a huge increase on what we'd achieved in recent elections, the biggest increase in vote share since Clement Attlee led Labour to victory in 1945, and that was the party's biggest tally since Tony Blair's first victory in 1997. And it was also much bigger than the Tories, what the Tories had achieved to enter government in 2010 and 2015. And yet we know that, of course, it still failed to translate into power. So the electoral system that we have does create some odd results and patterns. And that's why obviously there is clear need for electoral reform. Because no government should be able to win a big majority on a minority of the vote. And under PR voting systems, seats would be more closely, would more closely match votes, and we could begin to tackle the scourge of millions feeling unrepresented and ignored. And it would also, I think, obviously allow for the representation of minority views, political strands that struggle to feel represented through mainstream parties. As an aside, it's therefore no coincidence, for example, that under, New Labour, there was a significant left push for PR, and under Corbyn, it was parts of the right of the party that started to talk about it more as well. I want to sort of talk about representation as well, because there are also strong arguments that PR could create new avenues of political power for people potentially sort of traditionally denied fair access to power. And as the first hijab-wearing MP in what is coined, the most diverse of parliaments ever, I'm proud that Labour have led the way in increasing more women and BAME representation in Parliament. But there is, more to be done. I really think that diversity should not be conflated with accountability and representation. And, I come from a proud tradition of solidarity and community action. My father spent decades supporting precarious migrant workers, organising tenants and residents. But my family, like many families, we really know firsthand what it feels like to be forgotten by political institutions. So, we have to be really clear. I think, at the top of any electoral reform agenda must be empowering our communities. And we really have to acknowledge that many BAME communities have specific concerns around PR as well, such as, what John's actually mentioned as well, the risk of extremist groups gaining power. And that threat of the far right is very real. In my constituency in East London, only decades ago, BAME people felt sort of faced daily risk of just walking in the streets, as the far right had a strong base locally, including political representation. So, you know, I've heard arguments from people like Gary Young from The Guardians that it's better to expose such views by having them in the room, as it were, as part of the debate, than it is to have them festering in the shadows, if you like. It is also the case that racists have clearly been able to find expression via the first past the post system as well. So, I mean, I think, you know, it's really important in my view to think about electoral technicalities as part of the wider democratic system. And I think sort of only 2/3 of the UK electorate cast their vote in the 2019 general election. That was down on the 2017 general election from, you know, I think a couple of percentages. So, you know, it's really increasingly, I think, evident that people are overwhelmed and unsure what is real and what's not. And I just want to sort of say as well that, you know, the media bias, for example, against Jeremy Corbyn is unprecedented and has significant implications for any electoral system. You know, it did. And he's been described as sort of like the most smeared politician in history. And in one 2016 study, we found that, you know, 75% of all press coverage, including that of the state-owned BBC, factually misrepresented the then Labour leader. So, you know, the ongoing persecution of Jeremy, you know, one of the nicest people to lead a political party, is really shocking to continue to watch. And he isn't even the leader now. And as such, I think people increasingly understand that it's, you know, it's about attacking political democratic rights and representation. And I know, you know, that many I've talked to, you know, have been really appalled at the role of the media and how they've played a role, as am I. And I should say that the 2019 general election has sort of seen, you know, unparalleled levels of criticism of journalism. And the difference of strands of scrutiny of each party was extraordinary, I think. And in fact, Labour was invariably criticised for far too much policy and detail, whilst the Conservative Party's campaign barely spoke about what they would do once in power, but was really rather, you know, an ongoing smear campaign of creating misinformation, often unchallenged. I really don't want to believe that negative campaigning works, as I think it's deeply undemocratic, but clearly I think under our current system it does. And it's really worrying how much this can distort the political landscape. You know, this type of politics not only discredits the electorate and does not treat them with the respect they deserve, but it undermines the very fabric of democracy. And, you know, without going into too much, you know, I personally have been shocked at the racist and misogynistic attacks that I'm having to endure as well, including, you know, risk to my safety and so forth. And, you know, that's sort of a side point of drawing sort of similarities. And, you know, those kind of smear campaigns have been relentless. And we know, you know, of course, that BAME women in particular continue to face many barriers when getting involved in public life. But I'm going to conclude, and, you know, I believe in democracy, and that this is the only way possible to really create an equal and fair society. And cross-country analysis suggests that a lack of democratic rights is strongly associated with a reduction in economic inequality. And although sort of, you know, all of us here, you know, democracy is something most of us agree on in principle, right? It's obviously far harder to define. But I'm really clear that Parliament should accurately reflect and represent the society it serves. And it's important that people are able to feel that politics is for everyone. And, you know, democratic empowerment, as it were, shouldn't stop at the ballot box. It should be about the freedom of ideas, you know, workplace rights, including trade union freedoms, and of course, you know, the recent inspirational Black Lives Matter movement has shown, you know, the right to protest as well. And I'll end there for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Apsana. I'm not sure whether people are putting their blue hands up and they're just not registering, or whether they're not. But I've noticed 3 good questions on the chat anyway. Johnny, I was going to ask questions for Apsana and John and then move on to the other 3 people. Is that going to be all right for you?
Can I come in fairly soon, Sandy, and then I'll have you stay around for some questions as well?
Why don't you come in now, and then we can do questions for the 3 of you when you finish. That would be great.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much, Sandy, and thank you to John and Apsana for those great speeches at the beginning. It's lovely to be able to follow both of them. You said in the introduction, I've always been a supporter of electoral reform. That is absolutely true. I supported it as a party member, I've supported it as an MP, and I suppose I'm here tonight to say I'll be continuing to support it and be an advocate for it as a member of the Shadow Cabinet. Why do I think it's so important? I mean, look, it has always seemed to me that the obvious starting point for any political system is that the number of votes that people cast should be broadly reflected in the composition of Parliament or whatever body is being elected. I mean, I have to say I find it absurd that on several occasions in our own history, we have had elections where the party with the fewest votes cast has won the election and formed the government. That's obviously happened in 1974 fairly recently, but on several occasions in our history, and that just cannot be right. The number of votes cast should be reflected in the composition of a parliament. I think, to be honest, that is the start and the end of the debate for me, but it's not just about the technicalities of systems and how we assign votes and who gets to sit in that parliament. I mean, my belief in this, to be honest, stems from the very deep sense of alienation that I had growing up in the northeast of England in the 1980s, which was clearly a time of enormous social change. I mean, the mines going, the shipyards going, the social fabric of the area being completely transformed. I think even Conservatives would agree with that. And there was a sense of having, I think, no purchase, no say, no input into a government who at the time, frankly, didn't really care at all how a place like the northeast voted. There was a sense in places like Sunderland and Durham, where I'm from, there was just no ability to change the country's direction when it mattered most. And what drives me so mad is that too often when you get into this debate, Sandy, people, they talk about strong and weak government, right? Strong government to me means good government. It does not mean government with an artificial majority that the public haven't given it, simply because we think that somehow works best in a technical sense over 4 or 5 years. Whatever people think of events in our history, like the Iraq War or the poll tax, look, they're examples of strong government. Now, I would argue very strongly they're not examples of good government. And it is a really interesting question as to whether, does our political culture shape the electoral system we use, or does the electoral system shape our political culture? But I do worry a lot about the general direction of the political culture of this country and how we deal with political problems. I think we are going further and further down a route towards a kind of deep, reductive tribalism, which I think at times forgets the purpose of politics, which is to come together and solve problems. If you look at the behaviour this week of our own government, which is, pretending that objections to the breaking of international law were about Brexit, even though Brexit has already happened, it's because they know they need to keep together the coalition that got them through that last election. And it means they have to look for problems rather than try and find solutions through that. If you look at most of their behaviour, I would say that they have to present the most extreme version of themselves, because if a more extreme party emerged on their other flank and took, say, 5% of their support, they know they'd fall apart. And it means we are all suffering as a result of that. Now, look, I acknowledge, and I always do, there is no perfect system. All electoral and political systems have good as well as bad features, but there are, I think, clear examples in the rest of the world where Westminster could work better. And some of those examples are closer to home than others. I think Scotland and Wales have better democratic systems than the one we use for general elections in the UK. And when we look at the alternatives available to us, there's clearly no system that will satisfy everyone. But I see an overwhelming case for a system like the one used in Scotland and Wales and Germany that provides a constituency link, and that's clearly a very important part of our political system, one that I support entirely, but which also delivers a broadly representative election. That means through the whole range of political opinions cast in an election, they are reflected in the result, and the system will give a majority when the public have given their consent to that majority. But it doesn't mean that there'll be a majority based on this false assumption that there should be a kind of multiplier effect when the public are unwilling to give one party sufficient support. And please, let's hear no more from people who say that our present arrangements are essential to form one-party government. Look, the DUP propped up the last government. We had the Conservative Lib Dem coalition before that. We had John Major, who was dependent on the Ulster Unionists. Jim Callaghan's government needed the Lib Lab pact. We've had minority governments coalitions regularly before the war. The history of this country is not one of first past the post delivering clear results. In fact, we've now lived for years in the UK with a proportional system delivering a majority government in Scotland, while Westminster's had one hung parliament after another in that time. I think the most crucial benefit of the kind of system I'm describing is that it avoids the vast electoral deserts where people in a part of the country, whether it's a county or a region, get no plurality of representation despite casting votes for a range of political parties. I've now been on the Labour Party's front bench for a decade. Now, when you're a shadow minister, one of your routine duties is being called to respond to debates in Westminster Hall. And I remember responding to a debate on travel. I think it was in one part of the southwest of England when I was the shadow rail minister, and there were 20 Conservative MPs on the government benches. There was just me on the opposition side to respond. And Tory after Tory would get up and say, "Oh, I see, only the opposition front bencher is here. We're a true blue county in our part of the world." If you look up the election results for a place like that, you will see in the southwest, often more people actually vote against the Conservative Party than for it. Clearly, they're the biggest party, fair play to them, but a system that then gives 100% representation to a party that doesn't even get the majority of votes in an area cannot be right. And we cannot just view this as a narrow partisan issue. As Democrats, we have to look at this from the point of view of what the public put forward and how we then respond to that public demand. If we're not doing that, we have to ask ourselves what the purpose of elections is to begin with. It cannot just be about maximising individual party advantage and then finding a system that gets us to that point. That's not good enough, and it's not what democratic systems are based on. I hate it when people try and say this agenda is about Labour not winning the last 4 elections. No. Supporters of any political reform throughout the ages have done so out of patriotism and duty. I think all of us, we simply want this country to work better, and we want it to work better for everyone, every corner of the country. And this campaign is no different. I just want to end by addressing the claim that we also hear quite a lot of, which is that people somehow do not want change. That they're not asking for it, it's simply people like us who have a political obsession. Look, I ask everyone listening today to consider, do we really think that people are highly satisfied with the nature of British politics today? I don't think they are. I think they're worried. I think they're worried about the political system. I think they're worried about how it struggles to resolve problems that this country faces. And there is no magic wand we can wave to change everything. If we want a better politics, we have to start reflecting on how people vote and how they get that representation in the composition of Parliament. And I think as a Labour Party, we've got to have the courage to advocate for that change to fair votes for all. It is my sincere hope, building on what John said, that over the next few years we will get a chance to do this. And seeing a turnout like we've got tonight at this event is extremely heartening for that purpose. So thank you very much, and thank you for your support.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. That was great. And I'm going to ask, we've got 10 minutes for questions for the first 3 speakers. I'm going to ask Dylan Morris to ask the first question, if that's all right. Have you been?
Dylan, you should be able to unmute.
Dylan,
can you try and unmute? Otherwise, we'll just oh, he's unmuted. You're unmuted now, Dylan. You should be able to speak. Oh, Dylan, can you maybe your sound isn't working. Depends on how you connected.
that's very unfortunate.
Yeah. Have you got the?
In that case, I will ask Adpag.
Yeah.
Adam, you had a question earlier on?
Yes, it's the name's Adam actually, but yeah, it's just it's a really bad name. I think it was kind of tied into what Apsana was saying about kind of reaching out to communities and unions, but is there also kind of need to also reach out for, I don't know, possibly the lonely, the kind of very much the floating voter, because we are it's a very mobile country. Like I'm somebody who's lived in multiple cities, and it's sometimes hard to find those connections, and sometimes I have to start again. And I was just kind of wondering, it can actually, the kind of empowering talks that we go on about with constitutional change, can that be part of the emotional pull to certain people? Can we use it in that way?
Thank you very much, Adam. I'm going to ask either Roger or Hilda, I can't tell which of you it is, to ask your question that you had put up in the chat as well.
It's Roger. I was on video, but I switched myself off. I was really responding to John McDonnell's point about the House of Lords, and while I accept that the House of Lords is very undemocratic and is subject to all sorts of difficulties of packing and so on, it also has a substantial depth of expertise. And I think the conundrum is, how do we get a good revising chamber that represents that draws in that expertise and yet is democratic in its appointment? There have been one or two interesting suggestions on chat.
Yes, thank you very much. And can I also ask Colin Redman, do you want to ask the question that you put on chat as well, Colin?
Should be able to unmute Colin. There we go.
Yes, I can. I think probably I can't start my video, but can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, I think probably most people on this meeting will actually already be committed to some form of proportional representation.
Right.
The question is how do we sell it to other people generally? How do we sell the benefits of it? I think there was some talk just recently on about which models, whether it's sort of Germany or Scotland or Wales or so on. But also, I think people have some reluctance about where it works somewhere. Let's take Israel, for instance, where maybe it's the extreme parties that actually hold the balance between the main parties. You have to concede to them, and it leads to a form of extremism as well. So it's just actually how you get the message across, I think, to a broader public that perhaps PR is in their interests and they should go for it.
That's fantastic, thank you. Apsana, do you want to give some answers to some of those questions?
Apsana? Okay, try.
Okay. Well,
Okay, so I was muted for a second. So I think just to come back to what Adam was saying, really, I mean, I think there is definitely an untapped population that we really need to encourage to engage with the political system. And I do actually think, electoral systems are the way in which to do it. Now, there are a lot of technicalities in that, but I do think that we have we have higher rates of voter apathy among the youth than some other European countries, for example. So, whilst I don't sort of believe in making voting mandatory, for example, from certain ages above, I do think that there needs to be a wider sort of education around the electoral system targeted to a younger population that is in a lot of ways party political, and I think that would probably be a way in which to I suppose bring a level of enthusiasm in and translate that into activity in the political system overall. I do think that what was just said about sort of extremist parties holding the government or governments to ransom in some ways, where they have to kind of concede. I think it kind of touches upon what Jonathan sort of said earlier as well about how under the current system it's not quite worked either. So we've seen that majority governments haven't just sort of come about through elections. They've come about through various concessions that have been made to smaller parties. Yes, I sort of mentioned about the threat of the far right, for example, and what that means in a country like this. But we also saw that in first past the post, as far as I'm concerned. We saw that in the 2019 general election under the current system. So that the risk of that, I think, in some ways applies under both systems, but I think we have to try and sell PR in a way which really talks about the broader long-term interests. And this system is not necessarily going to be, of course, faultless, but I do think that there is much more to be gained from it in the long term in terms of changing political culture, but also actually, I think, holding political parties to account better to the public as well.
thank you. John?
I'll just go rid of this question on the House of Lords and expertise. let's be realistic. At the moment, in terms of the appointments to the House of Lords by the current government, it is either retiring MPs that he's offered bribes to get them in the House of Lords to vote a certain way, or people he's sacked in the past and he doesn't want any more problems within the Conservative Party, he shoved them in there, or they're people that have given quite a significant donation to the Conservative Party. That's what's happening. That is current political practice in this country, which if it was going on anywhere else, we would be vociferously calling it political corruption. That's the first point. And the way to use expertise is, well, that expertise by all means should be standing for election and elected bicameral chamber. Or what we can do is what happens anyway. And is you have a series of expert advisory groups and commissions, etc. You draw them in that way. So I think that you can overcome any possible loss of expertise that we now have in the House of Lords and use it another way. That's the first thing. The second thing is, how do you win the argument? Well, I think now, to be frank, we are, apart from the Labour Party, the rest of the political parties are fairly small, but we are now, our politics between elections is a politics of social movements. And so what we've got to do is in the discussions that those social movements are having, is actually we have to relate the issue that they're dealing with back to the electoral system at each occasion. And it's almost, and this is an opportunity under Johnson, I'm afraid, and I hate to say this, but it's almost asking the question, God help us, how did we get in this awful mess? And if you look back at it, because we have an electoral system that is able to be manipulated in a way that throws up people like Boris Johnson. And if we had a fair voting system, I actually think we'd have much more consensus building politics. It's as simple as that. So I think in those various social movements that are taking place at the moment, I think we should be asking the question, actually, how do we get here? How is it these problem hasn't been tackled effectively by government or elsewhere? And doesn't it relate back to how we elect these politicians, how they get there? And I think the quality of the politicians and the quality of decision making actually is influenced and does reflect the nature of political practice. And part of that political practice is the way we conduct elections and the method of conducting elections. The next bit is part of the issue about loneliness. I find really interesting because there are lots of individual isolated people, but people feel even more isolated and alienated if when they vote, their vote often is completely irrelevant in certain constituencies. And that's why we can argue that actually the reform of the electoral system gives people more power, but at the same time, that has the opportunity of bringing more people together as well. I just, final point from me, this starts at small discussions within our party that then build, and then I think we go on the stomp, but we have to connect it to real world activity. So for example, there's a renters campaign at the moment in terms of tackling the eviction crisis that's going to hit us in the next few weeks if we don't get it sorted. And I think we should be saying, actually, the reason we're in this crisis and the threat of evictions again is because we have a Conservative government that is beholden to landlordism, and landlords are funded by them as well. And if you had a proper electoral system, all this would be exposed and people would have a greater opportunity of electing a government that better reflected the breadth of society rather than the narrowness that it does at the moment.
Thanks, John. And Johnny? Is Johnny still with us? Have you had to go?
Unmute.
Sorry, yes, I'm still here, Sandy. The controller has to unmute us, so we just try in vain. Look, without getting into trouble for straying too far from my work and pensions brief, I've got to agree with John on the House of Lords. There is expertise in the House of Lords, that's right. We just had the pension schemes bill where Labour Lords, my shadow working pension scheme, done some brilliant work, absolutely brilliant work on that before it comes to the Commons. It's for that reason I would say if we were finding a better way to have a House of Lords, I'd have no hesitation in making sure people like that, like Maeve Sherlock and Jenny Drake, who are experts in pensions for working people, would be the representatives of the party. But I really feel that the way the House of Lords is going with the appointments that we've seen, it is you know, damaging the reputation of our entire political system. I think some of that has become, quite frankly, indefensible. That it's right to say it should be part of the discussion alongside evolution and representing the different regions of England and Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland within the second chamber. On the argument about how we, you know, make this argument and push it forward, look, things are changing already. Partly that's because people are getting, I think, experience of different and better systems in other parts of the UK. That's certainly the case in Scotland and in Wales. But it's also not just because they've got different ways of doing things. Look, if you talk to someone like Gordon Brown, right, and the advice he would give a member of the Shadow Cabinet today like me, he is the first to point out that the political challenge that he faced when he was in opposition pre-97 was that it was a political map that had two sides, Labour, Conservative, right? That's what they were doing. One went down, the other one went up. That's clearly not the challenge today. Politics is much more complicated in this country. People have very different and more diverse views. That's not a bad thing. That's actually the case in most European countries. We shouldn't sort of lament the fact that, you know, it's not like the 1950s where most of the votes go to just two political parties. The reality is changing. Okay, and we can pretend that isn't happening. We can say get nostalgic about the past, or we can acknowledge that and say, well, look, let's work with how people are feeling about this, how they're voting, how other parties are in existence, and let's build on that. And I think the crucial thing that I've seen change over the last few years is, first of all, not just a bigger turnout at events like this, but I think there's certainly a lot of movement in the trade unions where people are just looking at that and saying, actually, you know, if the big unions start to change their positions, that will be fundamental, clearly, for the wider party's position. I also think that, look, I can say this as someone who, I didn't vote for Jeremy in the leadership contest, but I can say I certainly admired the huge groundswell of support that generated. There was a time when people basically said, look, mature democracies, people sort of get less engaged in politics, it's just a feature. And again, that's not the case around Europe or in the UK. We've seen, you know, massive post-financial crisis engagements of people. Sometimes that completely swept aside the traditional centre-left, left-wing parties. We saw that in some countries. It actually came through the Labour Party because of the way we had our new leadership election system at the time. And I, you know, I admire that, the fact that so many members in some parts of the country that hadn't even had a traditional kind of trade union working class movement, the Southwest is a good example of that, you know, was so hungry for political engagement, was so keen to get involved. I think that's got to be a good thing, hasn't it? No matter what your politics are. And I think, you know, I've seen on the chat people having a little bit of a, you know, parts of the party, Blair versus Corbyn. Look, make this as wide a campaign as possible. You know, it should be something everyone in the Labour Party feels they can get involved in, and beyond that too. Don't make it a sectional or a factional campaign. Open it out, work with people, build it as wide as possible, because there are things happening. There is a hunger, I feel, for change. Let's make sure when those people come to engage in the party, they find representatives and members welcoming them in and saying, look, we think we're going in the right direction. We want your support. Let's push this through the party.
Thanks, Johnny. I know that there are some more people waiting to ask questions. Can I beg you to wait until the end, and you can ask your questions at the end, because we have Ruth Cadbury and Daniel Zeichner, who've very kindly agreed to go after this round of questions in order to allow John McDonnell and Apsana and Johnny to answer the first round of questions, because I'm not sure whether they'll be able to stay till the end. So can I call on Ruth now, please?
Sandy, I have to go, so thanks for inviting me.
Cheers, John.
So do I have to go as well. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Great
Bye.
meeting and a really good turnout as well. It's inspiring. All the best.
Okay, thank you. So I'm Ruth Cadbury, Labour MP for Brentford and Isleworth in West London, and I think Vice Chair of Labour Campaign for Electoral Reform. So I've supported electoral reform for a long time, but I had direct experience of national PR 3 years ago, almost to the day, because I went to New Zealand on a family visit and suddenly realised I was arriving the day before the general election. So my younger son and I went door knocking in Manurewa, which is a working class Labour voting suburb of South Auckland, where there was no doubt that Louisa Wall was going to be re-elected as the Labour MP, but the party needed to get the Labour vote out in order to improve Labour's chances in the list, and hence a better, more chance of a Labour government. Now, we have a Labour government, obviously, in New Zealand, led by Jacinda Ardern, and Helen Clark will say more about that, no doubt, in the meeting tomorrow at 10 o'clock, about how that coalition was arrived at. But the gist of it is that New Zealand voters, as do voters in many democracies around the world, in fact most democracies around the world, they have two votes for their constituency representative and for the party preference. And we have it in London, where in London elections. But I mean, it was really interesting being in New Zealand for a number of reasons, but we've got to, and I won't go into them now, but New Zealand it's always been progressive when it comes to democracy. It's the first modern democracy to give women the vote, and it replaced its first past the post system with PR in 1996. And Jacinda Ardern, as we now know, as we know, that she leads one of the world's most popular progressive governments, although she is in a coalition with quite a Conservative party, New Zealand First, and it's looking like she's going to do even better, and Labour's going to do even better in the general election, which is now going to be in October this year. So I think there's no doubt, and the previous speakers and most of the comments so far agree that our electoral system has to change. 19 out of the last 20 governments have been elected with a minority of the votes cast. Almost a third, this is a shocking figure, a third of registered voters, some 14.6 million people, didn't vote in the last general election. And for many, they see little point. They live in rock solid, safe Labour or Conservative seats, so their vote they knew would make little change to the outcome. But when comparable countries with PR have been studied, it's been estimated that for the UK, some 5 million more UK voters would have voted if they'd known that their vote counted. And it's also likely that more of those non-voters would have voted Labour than voted Conservative. Now, we've got PR in the UK, and Tony Blair's Labour government brought in PR in London, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And I'm, being a London party activist, was a councillor and now an MP, I can feel the benefit of that sense of representation, even though my constituency assembly member is and probably always will be Conservative, being in southwest London. Hounslow being linked with, Labour Hounslow is linked with Conservative voting, generally Kingston and Richmond councils. Labour comes third in those two local authorities. So, you know, as with other systems, national systems in London, we have a mixture of constituency and list candidates. It gives voters a choice as well. They can also choose between personality and party, which we can't in the first past the post system. And all of us who've been on the doorstep as candidates will have experienced the quote, "I like you, but I don't like your leader, so I'm not sure which way I'm going to vote." Or even occasionally, "I'm Labour through and through, but I don't like you because of how you voted on." Of course, that hardly ever happened to me. But the system gives them that choice to use both their preferences. It also ensures that everyone has someone they can go to. And again, in southwest London, we've always been able to go to Labour Assembly members if we weren't getting anywhere with our Conservative representative. But electoral reform isn't everything. It's part of democratic reform. We need to address the role and the remit of Parliament. We need to, as has already been discussed, the democratically elected second chamber. John McDonnell talks about abolishing the House of Lords. I assume he means that in the context of replacing it with a democratic elected second chamber. I think I'd prefer to remain in a bicameral system, personally. we need a constitutional settlement for the devolved administrations. Look how the Conservative government have been walking all over the devolved nations in the internal markets bill that's going through Parliament at the moment. We also need a proper devolved system for local government as well. And we need to look at the relationship between government, Parliament and the judiciary, which was so badly strained last year over prorogation. We've also got to look at privacy, freedom of information, control of the media, the funding of parties, and absolutely votes for 16 and 17-year-olds. But even, you know, let's not pretend democratic reform is not the be-all and end-all of better democracy. And I think good democracies have other things as well. They have good leadership. And I go back to New Zealand as an example. They have local decision-making powers, that, you know, far more local power over decisions that affect the local area. And that's coupled with local fiscal powers, both for spending but also for income generating. Parties and politicians that engage, they listen and they communicate effectively are all other factors of what make good democracies. But a stepping stone to a good democracy has to be a better electoral system, more inclusive, more representative and fit for the challenges of the 21st century. So Colin asked, how do we get there? Obviously, electoral reform is probably not the top of most people's agenda, but aspects of the impact of bad democracy very much are. The climate crisis, the crisis of inequality, and now we're seeing the public health crisis. You know, we have to address these. But if we're going to win, when we win, reform has to be on agenda. It won't resolve, electoral reform won't resolve our constitutional crisis, but without it, we can't resolve the other changes needed. Whoops. Oops. Oh, I set my alarm. Sorry. So how are we doing it? So please do have a look at the LCER submission to the National Policy Forum this year, which went into a lot of detail. But we've already been talking on this chat about the democratic, having a democratic convention, and Labour Campaign for Electoral Reform is working on us having a democratic convention. It's working with Make Votes Matter, Open Labour, Compass, the Electoral Reform Society and other organisations to generate a proper debate on the electoral system. The movement's called Labour for a New Democracy. 10 o'clock tomorrow morning is the launch event for that. So meanwhile, what can you do as party members? And I'm assuming that most people on here are party members who believe in electoral reform and want to do something. So if you've not already got CLP policy, please get CLP policy through your CLP. There's model motions on the LCER website. Don't be afraid of the debate. It's been calculated by LCER that 75% of party members support electoral reform. And I would ask as well, please, for those of you with Labour MPs, please encourage them to join LCER. There's strong support among MPs in Parliament, and Labour MPs in particular, and have been in previous debates, not in this Parliament yet, but it's not reflected in membership of LCER by MPs, and LCER is about to do a recruitment drive, but you can also help with that and just giving your MP a little chivvy to do that, particularly if you know their supporters. And we've not yet had a sense of the many new Labour MPs, Apsana Begum's generation of MPs, to see how many of them are supporters. So LCER is about to do a membership drive. Please do join in with that. And join yourselves if you're not already a member. And I'll just conclude, as I said, electoral reform is key to democratic reform, and even democratic reform isn't the be-all and end-all of a better democracy, and isn't alone going to address the voters' disconnect with Westminster, but we have to start that process, and core to revolutionising voters' relationship with government and to Parliament and to their local authority, of course. let's have the Labour Party leading the charge, and hope to see a Labour Party in government implementing those changes. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruth. That was brilliant. Thank you very much. Sorry. It's really quite difficult to unmute yourself on this thing, isn't it? Thank you so much. And I'll call on Daniel to speak next, and then we can have more questions at the end. That'd be fantastic.
Thanks, Sandy. And hello, everybody. I'm Daniel Zeichner, Labour MP for Cambridge, and fantastic contributions from all our speakers. I'll try not to repeat the same points that have been made. I just reflect, I guess, in my political life, which has all been in the east of England. I've probably spent half of it in rural areas and half of it in urban areas. And I think my point is largely going to be about local government. But I would reflect, I mean, I'm in my later years, and it seems to have been a lifetime's journey. As a lot of people probably did during lockdown, they probably turned out some of the rubbish in their rooms. And I actually found something that wasn't rubbish, but it was Raymond Plant's report back in the early 90s, which I think he did for Neil Kinnock. And actually some of it still bears rereading to this day. And it just made me reflect a bit. It was about that time that Mary first encouraged me to get involved in electoral reform. She's on the call today, I think, as ever, and I thank her for that. But we've been through quite a few staging posts when you think about it through those years. There was the kind of moment of possibility in the Blair government with the Jenkins proposals, which I think many of us look back to with some fondness. There was then, exactly as Ruth has outlined, the various innovations that the Labour government produced. There was then, of course, the low point, perhaps, the AV referendum under the coalition, and Cambridge was, of course, perhaps predictably one of the few places that voted in favour. But I suppose one thing I would just say, reflecting back on all that, and it was very interesting listening to Ruth just now, is I'm not sure that the good experiences that there have been in some places are understood in other areas. It's the usual thing. People don't really understand how other parts of the country work. They know their own areas. And I do think certainly some of the experiences in popular kind of understanding within the Labour Party are sometimes not necessarily seen as particularly positive. And I think we've got to win that argument with party members. I would also say that I think, despite the fact it's been a very long journey, and it sometimes hasn't seemed to be that hopeful, I fear, and I do fear this a bit, I think the country is entering a very dangerous period, because I think actually our political system, which is based on consent, is going to start to run into some serious obstacles soon. I think we're seeing this with the disillusionment and disenfranchisement of many people with the current system. I think exactly, again, as Ruth alluded to, what we're seeing with the Johnson government is quite clearly tearing the United Kingdom apart. And that's going to create both opportunities and threats, but it's certainly going to create change. One of my great frustrations with I had many around the lack of debate around our relationship with the European Union, I say lack of debate advisedly, it seemed to me a very ill-informed debate at the time, was whatever structures you have, is always going to be a relationship between the centre and one power and another. And it was never discussed, I thought, in a sensible, rational way. Much could, of course, have been learned from the discussions the Americans had when they set up their constitution. But no, there was no comparison made, and just very simplistic, because in the end, we do not value local government in this country nearly enough, in my view. And I think that should be one of the radical drives for an incoming Labour government in a few years' time. And I hope we'll be, exactly as John McDonnell said, using this first 18 months, 2 years as a period to think about some of those points. Because not only is the UK in danger of breaking up, and I don't speak here as a great fan of the monarchy, but let's be honest, the monarchy, the Queen is not going to live forever. And actually, I do think she's quite a stabilising feature for a lot of people. At the same time, the actual physical building of our Parliament is falling around about us, and we may well be moving out of Parliament. My point is, with all these things, is I think people's consent to government is actually quite a fragile thing, and it's based on a whole range of emotional things as well as law, and that creates both risks and opportunities. And I think it's we need to be thinking it through, basically. I would just say in passing, I do think it's a shame that when people in Parliament think about moving somewhere else, the first thing they do is think of a replica chamber rather than actually creating a new shape, which actually might produce a more consensual politics. But that's perhaps a discussion for another day. The main point I want to make is that the government is talking about devolution. It's got its own reasons for wanting to do that. I'm not sure they're the reasons that we would share. There's been quite a lot of discussion in local government circles in the last few months about plans to create more unitary authorities across the country. Again, an opportunity, I would say, because if you're changing your kind of councils and local government, then when better time to actually think about how you elect people. And this has been my main point. My observation from the east of England over many years has been exactly, I think Johnny Reynolds touched on this earlier. Labour gets 15 to 20%, even in the most difficult areas. And yet, in council after council, no Labour representation. And it works the other way too. You know, in my city of Cambridge, there are no Conservative councillors. That's ridiculous. It's not the case there are no Conservatives in Cambridge. There are, and they should be represented, in my view. So I think, particularly in local government, I think it would make a huge difference, because I think in far too many places, people quite understandably think, well, what is the point in voting? Nothing's ever going to change. I'm not represented. And it just leads to that ongoing level of alienation and disenchantment. So I strongly hope, and I speak as a shadow DEFRA minister with responsibility for rural affairs, I think it would make a real difference in many parts of the country by changing that system to get much more active participation through that better representation. And I think that could be positively transformative. So we still need to win the argument within the party, but obviously there were promises in previous manifestos, not perhaps anywhere quite as strong as some of us would like to have seen, certainly on reforming the House of Lords. I've been a long-term Lords reformer, but I think we need to extend that, and not just in itself, but because it can be part of our radical plans to really transform parts of the country that are too often forgotten and left behind. So thank you, Sandy, and you're much missed in the DEFRA team. I can tell you, you were a hard act to follow.
Well, bless you. Thank you, Daniel. I'm not sure that, but yeah, anyway. So thanks everybody who stayed on, and I'd particularly like to thank the patient people who'd asked questions earlier on. And so I will ask Wynne Davis to ask the first question. Wynne, can you unmute?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. I had a problem in an earlier session. I'm now in my 70s, and I have been a supporter of electoral reform since I was in my late teens. And I've heard the argument so many times. It was very interesting. About 6 or 8 years ago, I was a candidate to be a councillor in London, and I had a co-candidate whose wife was Spanish, and we were canvassing, and he said to me, "You don't have to do any of this in Spain, because all you have to do is keep the party happy and you'll get yourself reselected." And so that switched my view to some extent. And I am now strongly of the view that we've got to keep the parliamentary member link and then have a system of regional top-up. I would have suggested something like 500 out of 650 elected by the standard way we currently do elections, then 150 to make the electorate to reflect the overall national voting, and that to me would produce a fairer House of Commons. Two other quick points. A lot of people have raised questions about, you know, are we going to let in the extremists? UKIP in 2015 got 4 million votes and got 1 MP. Now, no way is that democratic. And, you know, yes, so we will get some nutters elected, but that is the price we have to pay for a fair system that reflects the whole country. Because if these views are out there in the country, unfortunately, they deserve representation. And then we beat them in the arguments in the House of Commons. And the final thing is, absolutely right. We've got to do something about local government as well. I was in London where we had 43 Labour councillors and 8 Labour. I'm now living in Shropshire where we had 8 out of 72 Labour elected last time, and the Tories have got 50 out of 72 on less than half the vote. Thank you very much, and thanks for all the speakers.
Thanks, Wyn. Can I ask Stephen Greif to ask the next question? Stephen, are you here?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, quick question really regarding citizens' assemblies or democratic forums, whatever you want to call them, that were mentioned earlier. I think there's a real opportunity here. There's a lot of different topics we've talked about, not just electoral reform, and it feels like there's an opportunity for a series of citizens' assemblies, probably with fed by local juries as well, smaller local assemblies. I guess the question for the guests is do they feel there's an opportunity to get these set up by the cross-party select committees in the way that the recent climate assembly was set up, and could that take out some of the politics from this topic and make it a bit more cross-party?
Thank you very much. Yes, and also we have a question from Maria Yakubu.
Thank you, Sandy. I do have a question. If you don't mind, I would also just like to do a little plug. I'm the membership secretary of the Labour campaign for electoral reform, and I was really happy. Thank you so much, Ruth, for reminding everybody that's here that if you are a Labour Party member and you are a supporter of electoral reform, then you really should join the LCER. I would love LCER to have, so many members that we cannot be ignored. I would love us to have sort of thousands and thousands of members. I would love sort of, 100 and something MPs to be members. I'd like, 500 constituencies to be affiliated. So we're kind of a bit short of that. But our membership is growing a lot. So everybody here, you can join very easily, just go to our website. So that's the end of my plug now. But I also have a question. And my question is this. I think, among the Labour Party membership, it's very clear that we have won the argument. The vast majority of Labour Party members want to see us adopt proportional representation. They want it to be in the Labour manifesto. Every time we go out to a constituency Labour Party meeting, we win the argument. There's maybe 1 or 2 people who don't agree, but generally we win. We know also that we have to change minds in the trade unions. We have to, and we're doing that. It's a little bit slower. But again, we're going out to trade union branches, and there is every evidence. And then, of course, there's the Parliamentary Labour Party. And that is what I want to ask you two about, because it is absolutely clear that Labour MPs, there are many Labour MPs who are fully behind electoral reform, like you, like all the people were here, and many more. But there is no doubt that 75% of Labour MPs, we don't have the levels of support among MPs that we do among ordinary party members. And some of them I think we'll never win, but some of them we must work on. And, that is a really important thing. So I would like to ask you, what do you think, what should we be doing? And I guess, should we be roping you guys in to help? Is it best, for example, to get constituents to work on their own MPs? What should we be doing? And that is the end of my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. I'm fairly sure Jonathan had to leave us, Johnny Reynolds had to leave us after the first session. So I'm just going to ask Ruth and Daniel to answer those 3 questions, and you don't need to bother about answering the bits that aren't questions. Thanks.
Okay. Right, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Great. Okay, thank you. I'll start with Maria's. Funnily enough, Maria, Sandy has sent me a draft letter to email to go to MPs, Labour MPs, about joining. So that there's a piece of work that is going to happen in the next few weeks where we're going to use all our various methods of communication, including WhatsApp groups, to encourage our colleagues to join LCER, because I think it's been some time since there's been a parliamentary membership drive, which is why I said to people on this call, if you've got Labour MPs or you are friends with Labour MPs, please do encourage them to join. And I think I saw the link to membership on the chat. So I hope that helps. Stephen, citizens' assemblies. Yeah, I mean, as I say, there's a piece of work that's been going on and being developed among not just LCR but a number of groups on a convention on democratic reform. Say, which I think there'll be more in this multi-organisation event tomorrow at 10 o'clock, which is part of the Labour Connected events. Citizens' assemblies. I mean, I was blown away by what I learnt about the way the Citizens' Assembly, I wouldn't say quietly, but without controversy in the long term, got abortion law changed in the Republic of Ireland, without, so far as I can see, a large pushback from the anti-choice side, and because of the way people all across Ireland, of all political, religious persuasions and views on the topic. So I think when it showed that when citizens' assemblies work well, and from what I could tell, there was a lot of public awareness and public awareness of it. I mean, we've had the very good example launched last week of the Citizens' Assembly set up by the by UK Parliament's select committee groups, and I'm on Transport Committee, and we had the report to us last week in a discussion at our meeting last week. It was an internal meeting, and I think and the results. The conclusions are really, really interesting, and we understand that several of the participants in that Citizens' Assembly did change their view and became, from being opposed to serious moves on to address climate change, to being very supportive. My problem with that Citizens' Assembly process is that it didn't seem to have the same public awareness and traction as I think the abortion debate did in the Republic of Ireland, and how not to go about electoral reform is the example of the coalition government led by the Lib Dems on the AV process. Who was interested? The few people who did vote generally voted it down, and even those who do support electoral reform didn't support AV as the process. And it was like, most ordinary people, not political anoraks like all of us, but AV, what does that stand for? What does that mean? And I just remember there being just virtually zilch public interest in that debate. And so I don't think it's right for us to have a discussion at this point into what works and what doesn't, and what level of constituency representation. But though I think there has to be a local connection, there has to be a constituency element to whatever setup you have for PR. But this isn't the time and place to have that debate. That should come out of a broad public engagement in the Citizens' Assembly and the Citizens' Assembly process with sort of national cross-sectoral engagement. And then the solution emerges and you're more likely to get buy-in. So that's my take on it. Wynne, I think made a very positive point, because often that ends up being a negative point about about having political extremists being elected. And there was a time when there were BNP members on the Greater London Assembly, and they had zilch influence, and the BNP disappeared from London politics as an electoral force. Clearly, the Israel example shows the opposite, the power of extremists in government. No setup is perfect, but there's plenty of solutions that are more perfect than the very, very imperfect system we have at the moment. That's me good done, I think.
Thank you very much, Ruth. That's great. And Daniel?
Yeah, very, very briefly, Sandy. Wynne, I agree with you very much that there's a need to keep the constituency link. And of course, that's what Jenkins did, pretty much what you described. And I think that is actually the right model to take. I think you did ask a question, actually. You worried that we might get nutters elected. Well, I just offer you Christopher Chope, Peter Bone and Desmond Swain as examples of the current system, which doesn't seem to have a bar on some, well, I better be careful what I say outside the chamber, but I think you get my drift anyway. So no system is immune to, I'm afraid, the electorate do make some extraordinary choices. I guess in a lot of cases, this is more about how parties operate and their selection procedures, I suspect. The long-suffering people who are represented by those people may well not all feel entirely happy about it. On Stephen's point about the Citizens' Assembly, I think if you look back to the Constitutional Convention that led to the creation of the Scottish Parliament, that was an extraordinarily good model, very carefully done, very delicately done, cross-party. It really, you can do it, and it's a complicated mix. And I've always thought that's what we were trying to do when we talked about a constitutional convention. And as John said right at the beginning, it's not entirely clear to me either why we were never able to make it happen. I had to say much easier to make happen if you're in government, obviously. So I think that model, that participatory model, is a good one. Maria, I was interested to hear you say that you think we've won the argument with members. I have to say that when we had the AV referendum in Cambridge, it was by no means the case. I mean, you can argue about what, you know, from a reformer's point of view, whether that was a good or bad thing, but it wasn't a clear-cut case at all. I had quite a tussle with a lot of my people, and I just wonder whether we have really won the argument with enough members. I think there's more to do, and I suppose my point, we could go back to my original contribution. There are some of us who think it's worth doing for its own purposes in its own right, but I think locating it in a program of change and it being part of that change would persuade others too, because I don't think the current system can deliver the kind of social and economic change many of us want to see. I think it's got to be partly democratic change too, and that would be part of that. And I think that's quite a persuasive message for some of our colleagues who are still a bit worried about it.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I have a question that was put in the chat. I wonder if Juan Canham, would you want to ask that question? Are you still here?
Yep, I'm here. Yes, I've lost it in the chat, but it was basically in 2019, if we had managed to work with the Lib Dems in about 50 seats, we probably could have won in some form. However, we kind of couldn't really because of the position the parties were with each other, and whether you think that is a valuable approach or whether it's a red herring to try and work more closely with other opposition parties to get this through.
And a final question from Nkululelo. Hello.
Oh, hello, thank you, Chairperson. I've been listening carefully, and what I picked from this forum is that the Labour Party is trying to create a system whereby those groups which have been alienated politically before can be brought back into the mainstream for their views to be heard and to participate. And I agree with what we're talking about. But what I want to bring here specifically is that I represent a certain group of people who have been mentioned as immigrants. And the moment you mention the word immigrants, it's a community of people which Apsana Begum referred to as well. It will constitute of the first generation, second and third generation. I hope you understand what I mean first generation, those who came and claimed asylum and then their children and so forth. And to me, what is happening is, the question is, how does Labour reach that group? And my answer is, if I may understand from the context of being a Zimbabwean immigrant in this country that time, Labour Party has to, the moment you mentioned, I spoke to in our branch meeting about who, because I understand immigration policies are linked to foreign policies. And then I asked my colleagues at the branch level to say, so who determines the foreign policy in the Labour Party? I was told that there is a committee which deals with foreign policy. Then I asked myself, how do they get their inputs? As an example, from if you are dealing with a country like Zimbabwe, do they get that input from the so-called intelligence or from where? Because there are a lot of Zimbabweans here who can contribute to that foreign policy. But if they are not included in that process, Labour Party may not have a specific appropriate foreign policies about Zimbabwe. And this model of thinking will apply to a situation of Syria. It will apply to a situation of Belarus. I mentioned Belarus because I've lived there 7 years. And what is happening there, it informs me that it needs a really out-of-the-box thinking foreign policy towards what is happening there.
I'm gonna have to stop you there, sorry, we won't have time for the answers, but thank you very much indeed. Okay, Ruth. Oh no, I'll ask Daniel. You can finish off. Daniel, you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you. Two very good points. And you look at you make very strong points there about how we develop our policies in general. And that, of course, is about the way the party works internally. And I've been a long-term fan of the National Policy Forum. And I think it's a very, very good process, which can get lots of people involved. And exactly as you say, having party members who've got knowledge and experience themselves is an invaluable tool. So that's about how we as a party make policy. And that's probably a debate for another day, but your point is very well made. On the working with other parties, I feel quite strongly about this actually, because I'm in a part of the world where it often comes up. And all my experience tells me it's very hard to do it because the voters aren't pawns who move around on a chessboard. And even if the politicians come to an agreement, the voters very rarely are sympathetic to that, in my experience. So it's always something which I find we all find frustrating. In so many areas, it's quite clear that the Tories are not in a majority. They wouldn't get 50%, but if the opposition is split, there's a difficulty. I'm afraid the answer is we've got to go out and win for Labour, and that's what we've got to do. There is no shortcut.
Fantastic, thank you, Daniel. And Ruth?
Okay, Nkululeko, I agree with Daniel. As I say, how we make party policy is through the National Policy Forum, and then it's the Shadow Cabinet and the National Executive Committee who formulate the manifesto prior to an election. The National Policy Forum has been working on, and Sandy should say a bit more about this, because in terms of electoral reform and where we are with the National Policy Forum and electoral reform, because you've done a lot and brought trade unions into the debate and so on. But you're still saying we need to have constituency Labour parties to continue to pass the policy. There's an important point, Nkululeko, about representation and BME representation in elections and in the party, and there are, that we do have an issue in this country, although I think the Labour Party is far ahead of most other parties in terms of ensuring that both in terms of who is voting, but also who is standing for election, that those elected better represent the areas and the country that they're elected in. And as I say, our side of the House of Commons is more diverse in age, ethnicity, class than the other side of the House. But we can't be complacent, we've got a long way to go. Juan, you made an important point about electoral pacts. Would we have got more Labour MPs elected? Maybe, maybe not. We might have got a fewer Tory MPs elected. And it was quite frustrating when party energy was spent being sent to seats where we were either never going to win or not going to lose, where it should have been sent to marginal seats, which we had a national difficulty in getting us over the line. And maybe if there'd been a bit of an electoral pact, we might not have hung on to Emma Dent Code as a Labour MP who'd only been elected 2 years earlier in Kensington, but we might have had one less Tory MP if we'd done a pact with one of the other London seats. But frankly, that is a sideshow to the real deal, which is getting electoral reform. We need to get into government, and today or yesterday, Women Connected, today, tomorrow, Tuesday, is on this year's national getting together about how we can all have an equal chance to have a say in working together and to do that, and how we're going to work going forward to get a Labour government despite COVID. We've got time. It doesn't look like there'll be a general election until 2023, is it? 24? Anyway, whenever it looks like the Conservatives, maybe not with Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. It doesn't look like he's going to last the full 5-year term, but I have a horrible feeling we've got the Tories in power for 5 years. So let's make the most of it. Let's build those alliances and let's build that case and our credibility to winning power, because that is ultimately what the Labour Party is all about.
Yeah, thank you, Ruth. Thank you very much indeed. And you said that you wanted me to say a little bit about where LCR is going over the next year, which I will. And just before I say that, actually, I would like to, because I noticed in the chat there was quite a lot of stuff about systems, and in particular about STV and the alternative member system, both of which, in my opinion, work reasonably well in the places where they've been used. We don't want to have divisive arguments about what system will come up, and Ruth has made this point very clearly, and I think Jonathan Reynolds did as well, about the need for working through some sort of constitutional assembly or whatever, in order to achieve something that we can all go forward with. But what we have done as Labour Campaign for Electoral Reform is we've signed a good systems agreement. If you look on our website, you will see the good systems agreement that we have signed alongside representatives from all the other parties, with the exception of the Conservatives. And basically, we are all united around the fact that we need to retain the constituency link. We're all united around the fact that we need our system to be more proportional. We aren't trying to specify an actual system, but what we are saying is that it is perfectly possible to design a system which is both more proportional and which also retains the constituency link, and which doesn't rely on national party list systems like they have in Italy, or had in Italy and in Israel and countries. So this is a crucial year for electoral reform. The Labour Campaign for Electoral Reform has, as Ruth said, joined with Make Votes Matter, Open Labour, Compass, Unlock Democracy and others to run this joint campaign. We're going to be bringing a motion to the Labour Party conference in 2021. I say we're going to be bringing the motion. What we want is we want multiple submissions of a motion to the conference from constituency Labour parties and trade unions around the country. That was one very, very effective way of making sure that that was debated properly on the Europe issue a couple of years ago, and it will work for for electoral reform as well, getting a motion which has support from right across the country and from grassroots CLPs and trade union branches. And we will secure that commitment if we all work together. Please, please do look at our website, and if you can, come along to the launch of Labour for a New Democracy at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. You'll need to book that separately if you want to come to that, if you're not already booked in, because it's not being done through Connected. But you can do that too through our website, which is coming up on the chat page as I speak. I'm sort of hoping that John or Maria will post that on the chat any moment, the link to our website. You can go on there, you can book for the Labour for a New Democracy launch tomorrow, and of course you can also join and become a member of Labour Campaign for Electoral Reform, which is also excellent. And immediately after this event at 6 o'clock, or fairly immediately after this event at 6 o'clock, Chartists are holding their event with Clive Lewis, with Anne Pettifor, who's the author of the Case for a Green New Deal, and Paul Novak, who is the Assistant General Secretary of the TUC. So please do join us at 6 if you want to carry on similar sort of discussion, and that will be on the same link as you used for coming in on this. And then tomorrow morning we have a councillors and local democracy event at 8:30, and Ruth will be joining us for that as well. Glutton for punishment, Ruth, but thank you very much. And we will also have representatives from Wales and Scotland and rural England. And then we've got a youth event tomorrow evening at 6:30, and all of these things are easily found on our website, which, as you can see, is there on the chat page. Thank you all very much for joining us. It's been great, and I've really enjoyed listening to the speakers. I think it's been really good. Thank you.